Through years and years of refinement, organisms learn to adapt to its unique environment. If the organism cannot adapt, it will not evolve. The following are some examples that can help you better understand some of the changes organisms must go through in order to survive as a species. A single Japanese giant hornet has the ability to kill up to 40 defenseless honeybees. And if that hornet has a backup, then the bee colony is likely to be destroyed. The hornet invades the honeybee's hive and wreaks havoc on the bees using their giant scissor-like teeth. So the Japanese honeybees had to adapt to survive. The Japanese honeybees adapted to the threat of the hornets and developed a method where the group of honeybees would lure the hornet into the hive and swarm the intruder. The honeybees would then proceed to vibrate their abdomens and generate heat, cooking the intruder. By killing the invading hornet, the honeybees can now survive and pass down their genes. Another organism that has adapted to survive is the bee orchid. The orchid is a plant that not only looks like a bee, but smells like one too. This unique adaptation lures bees to help pollinate itself. The petals of the bee orchid look and smell like a female bee, so that male bees are drawn to the flower with hopes of mating. As the bees try desperately to mate with the flower, the orchid attaches its pollen to the head of the unsatisfied bee. After the bee has given up, it will inevitably come across another bee orchid and try to mate again. Only this time, the bee will be pollinating the new orchid. Organisms such as a woodpecker have developed several adaptations that have helped it survive. The woodpecker has a chisel-like beak used in drilling through wood while in search of food, and in order to prevent the woodpecker from sustaining brain damage while repeatedly hitting its head, the woodpecker has developed a spongy skull that absorbs the impact while drilling. The woodpecker also has special membranes surrounding its eyes to prevent them from popping out of their sockets while drilling for food. But wait, there's more. The woodpecker's tongue is also specially designed with sticky saliva and a barbed tip, so that bugs and grubs can't wiggle away. Although adaptations sound like the bee's needs when it comes to survival, not all adaptations increase the fitness of the species. A good example would be the behavior of lions. When a new male lion takes leadership over a pride, the new male may seek to kill the previous leader's infants, because males who have just arrived on the scene only want one thing: to have their own children with the mother, and by killing the infants, the mother can become receptive sooner. You may be asking yourself, but how is this behavior bad for the species? Well, that's a good question. You see, this behavior is bad for the species because it dramatically reduces the total number of lions, increasing their likelihood of extinction.
Evolution is easily understood if the change in the proportion of alleles in a population can be viewed. Donald Kaufman tried to show this through his experiment at Kansas State University. He conducted an experiment with normal colored mice, or old-field mice, versus beach mice, where he built outdoor enclosures, some with light soil and others with dark soil. In each case, he would put an equal number of mice with dark and light coat colors and release the hungry owl into each cage. This experiment yielded results that proved less contrast with the soil, led to better survival. Therefore, population of beach mice would evolve from dark to lighter color because the mice with the darker fur would be hunted more on the light colored sand and have a smaller chance of passing their genes forward to the next generation. In nature, three things are involved in creating an adaptation by natural selection: variability within the population, meaning that the coats in the mice have to have some differences in the color of their coats. Second, there must be differences in their genes that are heritable. And finally, genetic variation must affect the individual's probability of leaving an offspring. Random sampling can be seen as a toss up. For example, a parent with AB blood type and one offspring will have a 50-50% chance of either passing allele A or B to that one offspring. Because the number of offspring is not infinite, the frequency of the parent's gene will not be the same as their parents. So, in smaller populations, the proportion of different alleles can change entirely by chance, allowing new mutations to rise or fall in frequency. Results could cause genes to become fixed or lost completely. Genetic drift is a random process as opposed to a selection. Drift can change allelic frequencies either if they're useful or not. Selection gets rid of harmful alleles and raises the frequency of beneficial ones. Genetic drift won't lead to evolution of adaptations, but it can cause the evolution of features that are innocuous. External, visible features could also evolve through drift. In order to see selection in real time rather than over thousands of years, breeders enable us to see natural selection of just a few generations in a short amount of time. Artificial selection, such as animal and plant breeding, fulfill our aesthetic needs. For example, in animals, the common house dog has been selected for thousands of years, which have led to modifications in their shade and thickness of their coats, or the length or pointiness of their ears. In plants, the wild cabbage is the ancestor of broccoli, domestic cabbage, cauliflower, and Brussels sprouts. The main difference in artificial and natural selection is that the breeder decides which characters are good rather than nature. During artificial selection, convergent evolution can also occur. Convergent evolution occurs when selective pressures give similar outcomes, meaning organisms that are not monophyletic independently evolve similar traits as a result of having to adapt to similar environments or ecological niches. Take example the greyhound dog breed compared to the cheetah. Bacteria is the best organism to conduct tests on. They are cheap, numerous, and enable us to observe evolutionary change over thousands of generations in real time. These artificial experiments are the closest to natural selection because humans don't choose which individual chooses to reproduce. For example, Lenski put genetically identical E. coli under conditions which their food, the sugar glucose, was depleted each day and then renewed the next. The bacteria were able to accumulate new mutations, adapting them to this new environment under the varying food conditions. Barry Hall, tested with E. coli, deleted a gene that produced enzyme that allows bacteria to break down lactose. The geneless bacteria were provided with lactose as the only food source, and adaptive mutations occurred where the only food source was lactose, and they were able to use it to provide energy. Third, Paul Rainey. He placed the bacteria Pseudomonas fluorescens in a nutrient-rich broth, and genetically new bacteria different from the ancestor had formed in the same petri dish. Until the effects of natural selection, drugs against infectious diseases worked very well. There are strains of tuberculosis that have evolved resistance to every drug doctors have used against them. TB has once again become a fatal disease. Another great example is staph. In 1941, penicillin could wipe out every strain of staph, but years later, 95% of the strains are resistant to drugs. Mutations in individual bacteria gave them the ability to fight off the drug. Viruses have also evolved resistance to antiviral drugs, like AZT or azithromycin, which is designed to prevent the HIV virus replicating from an infected body. The evolution of resistance creates a race between humans and microorganisms. Pharmaceutical companies create newer drugs to replace the already existing ones that are not as effective against the viruses. However, there are species that have adapted to changes in their environment by humans. Insects have become resistant to pesticides like DDT, plants have adapted to herbicides, fungi, and worms, and algae have evolved resistance to heavy metals that have polluted their environment.
We have seen we have seen natural selection intervene by humans, but what about natural selection in the wild? We know for sure that it's very slow. If we take, for example, the evolution of feathers, we know that this process took thousands of years. Therefore, it makes it impossible for us to watch happen in real time. This also makes it hard for us to know what kind of selection was acting on the feathers. We know that natural selection does not happen if there is no change in the environment. Natural selection in the wild is hard to see because species are already well adapted to their environment. This means that natural selection has already acted on the species and brought them to a suitable fit with its environment. Although this does not mean that natural selection is not occurring. We have what is called stabilizing selection, which means that genetic diversity decreases and the population mean stabilizes on a particular trait value. An example of this is birth weight in human babies. Hospital statistics show that average weight of babies is around 7.5 pounds. These babies survive better than lighter babies or heavier babies. Lighter babies are premature and heavier babies have difficulty when being born. Therefore, the genes of the lighter and heavier babies have decreased. This decreases genetic diversity and stabilizes a particular trait, in which case is the 7.5-pound baby. In order to see natural selection in action, we must look at three things. We must look at species with short generation times. An example of this would be flies, which is the most common example, or we can look at mice, the above examples. Also, to see it, we have to see that the species are adapting to a new environment. For example, the mice of the beach. The dark mice are trying to adapt to the beach environment. We also must see strong selection causing rapid change. Because if it's not strong selection, it won't cause rapid change. An example of strong selection would be survival. This can happen in species that are invading a new habitat or experience severe environmental changes. One example of species invading a new habitat would be the soapberry bug. The soapberry bug lives on two different plants in the United States: soapberry bush in south central US and perennial balloon, southern Florida. In the last 50 years, these bugs have colonized three other plants with different fruit size. Because of the size of these plants, natural selection caused changes in beak size of the soapberry bug. There are two plants with larger fruit and one with smaller fruit. Natural selection caused large beaks for larger fruits and smaller beaks for smaller fruits. One example of severe environmental changes would be we can see through the wild mustard plants. Back in 2000, Southern California suffered a severe 5-year drought. By measuring the flowering time of the mustards at the beginning of the drought and at the end of the drought, we get the following results. Natural selection changed the flowering time. After the drought, the plants began to flower a week earlier than their ancestor. This is due to the lack of water. Therefore, if they would flower earlier, that means that they were able to leave their offspring and had a better chance of reproducing. We know that complex features take a long time to evolve. Many of them evolve, but we do not actually see them. Therefore, this brings us to the question, how can we be sure that selection was involved? The alternative theory is creationism, also known as intelligent design. They use unscientific claims. Advocates of ID say that it is a supernatural designer intervened many times during the history of life, making adaptations that selection cannot do, or producing miracle mutations. The argument of ideas is that traits that involve many parts that must cooperate for that trait to function at all defy Darwinian explanation, and therefore it has been designed by a supernatural agent. This is called the God of the gaps argument. What this is basically saying is that if we don't understand everything about natural selection, then it automatically means that it's evidence of a supernatural creation, which we know that it's crazy because we will never know how natural selection created everything because we were not around. So there's only one thing to look at, which is fossil records. To refute the claim of the ideas, we know one thing. We can make the argument that we know of no adaptation whose origin could not have evolved from natural selection. Looking at anatomical traits, let's say the horse hoof, we can see trace of their evolution in the fossil record when we have good fossils. We can see the order of changes that took place and the sequence of changes that happened, the step-by-step adaptive process. In every case, we can find at least a physical Darwinian explanation. We can see this in the evolution of land animals from fish and whales from land animals and birds from reptiles. Complicated cascade reactions. These are reactions that need different proteins to function in the pathway. An example is a blood clotting pathway, the set of reactions that involves a sequence of events that begin with one protein sticking to another in the vicinity of an open wound. This sets off a cascade of reactions that is 16 steps long with more than 20 proteins involved. Ideas claim that there is a supernatural hand in the pathway, and they say that if we as scientists do not know everything there is to know about a process, then it is automatically a supernatural hand involved. But scientists are discovering possible scenarios for how this pathway could have evolved. The system could have been built from an adaptive precursor. A key protein in the clotting process is fibrinogen. To prove evolution happened, there must have been an ancestral protein from which fibrinogen evolved from, and there is. But it turns out that this protein was not used for blood clotting, but it co-opted invertebrates to form a new function. Therefore, scientists right now may not know everything there is to know, but every day they're getting close to discovering new information. Is there enough time to build complex adaptations and diversity through natural selection? Yes, Thanks to the fossil records, we can compare evolution rates in the fossil records and in the laboratory. Rates of change in animal size and shape in the lab in conjunction with colonization studies are much faster than the rate of fossil change. Changes are from 500 times faster selection during the colonization to nearly 1,000 times faster laboratory selection experiments. This shows that there indeed was enough time. Because the lab work was faster than the actual fossil record, this shows that indeed, for thousands of years, there must have been enough time for selection to build complex adaptation and diversity. We can look at an example of natural selection in really complex organs. One of these is the camera of vertebrates. To test this, we can start with a simple precursor to actually model the evolution of the eye, and see if selection can turn the precursor into a complex eye in a given amount of time. We start with the precursor of a patch of light-sensitive cells, backed with a pigment layer retina. The model accepted only mutations to improve visual acuity, because we know mutations are random and they can occur in the wild. As expected, the model formed a complex eye going through similar stages like the animal. The eye folded inward to form a cup. The cup became capped with a transparent surface. The interior of the cup gowned to form a lens with dimensions that produced the best possible image. This is indeed evidence that selection can build really complex organs, because this was all done in a short amount of time.